And happy Tuesday, NCAA basketball fans. This is your weekly Trogcast, two really old guys talking NCAA basketball. Old guy number one, Jeff Zink here, and I welcome him, old guy number two, Jim Reaker. Tell you what, it certainly doesn't feel like basketball weather out there, but we'll take it before it changes back and we go into March.
Yeah, I think they're saying a high of 77, 80 degrees. I woke up this morning, I thought I was in Florida, but I'm not.
You're not, but it's okay as long as we can stay dry with as I say, good Lord willing, and the river don't rise, but the river's on the rise. Lots of things to talk about this week, and we'll lay it out here for our folks that are always listening. I've changed it from a wacky week to a typical week in the NCAA. We're going to talk a little bit about the rankings. We'll talk about how coaches should react coming into the end of the regular season, especially maybe if you're not in one of those big conferences that are going to send multiple teams to the tournament. And then put a little focus on the Big 12, which is going to have a big week heading into their final. But we'll start with, where we usually start. Like I said, can't call it a wacky week anymore because it's happened too often. But last week, 14 of the top 25 teams lost, including 7 in the top 10, a couple of them twice. Cincinnati lost twice. Ohio State lost twice. Not a good week for Ohio. Total of 19 games were lost by those 14 teams, but only 3 of which were the higher-ranked teams. That means 16 teams. It's just become almost redundant, a section we could skip. It's one of those years where you just never know.
Yeah, I've kind of, as I sat down to make my notes out this morning, the title I gave this last week, thinking about this, a lot of big teams lost, but we're starting to see the title I gave it, the cream is starting to rise to the top. And here's my point. It's the who we expected, who maybe fell down a little bit early, and we thought maybe they weren't going to be as good this year, and now as we start to get to the end, they're starting to come to the top. And, for example, in the Big Ten, who's on top now? Michigan State. Team you missed about, Purdue. Purdue lost 3. They were up as high as number 3 in the country and then lost 3. In the Big East, Villanova. Villanova has risen back close to the very top. In the Big 12, if you wake up this morning and look at the standings after last night, who's on top? Kansas. And, of course, one of the big stories all year, Kansas, are they going to win their, I can't remember, 13th, 14th in a row, break UCLA's record? And in the ACC, not right at the top, but coming close. Probably not going to make it to the top because Virginia has such a big lead there. But Duke is starting to move, after some big upsets early on. So it's the old customers, Jeff, that are starting to position themselves for the NCAA tournament. And here's another thing just to show how wacky this season was. I was looking at, I believe it was USA Today's rankings, and they rank how high and low every team has been that's in the top 25. And I went through in the top 25 teams this week in their rankings, which I believe the coaches poll, 14 of those 25 teams at one time or another during the season was unranked. So that just kind of tells you. I think the story, and I think it maybe is the way college basketball is headed for the foreseeable future. It's just it's parity. There's a lot of good players out there, and not everybody's getting them all. So I think this might be the way things are going to be again for the foreseeable future.
Well, you brought up this cream rises to the top idea last week too, and I kind of let it go. I mean, good teams are good teams, but you're saying cream rises to the top in parity in the same argument, and that kind of leads us right into the next thing that I wanted to say, why preseason ranking matters and why they don't. And you bring up, the top to the bottom, but there have only been 42 teams in the top 25. And that may seem like a lot, but it's not really a lot. And this is where they got it right and they got it wrong. The reason I'm putting this on here is I think the teams you're talking about and getting into the top 25, and they're winning, so we can't take that away from them, are the teams that the people want to see showcased when it comes tournament time. But you look back at things over season, it's also that wide openness. You look back at the early polls, and the teams that are in the top 25 now, all of these teams got no votes whatsoever in the preseason. Texas Tech, now at number 6, Auburn at 12, Clemson at 15, Ohio State at 16, Michigan at 17, Tennessee at 19, Houston at 23, and Florida State at 25. So the parity idea comes in there, but these are the teams that are going to shake it up and have shaken it up. I agree with you that some teams are coming up to clinch things that have been there forever and ever, but that leads me to think that this might be the most wide-open NCAA tournament that we've had in quite a while.
Oh, yeah, I agree. And here's another factor that I think is starting to play in is, you look at the NBA and Major League Baseball and almost like not so much, but pro football, they play so many games that you're going to lose some games. You're going to have off days because look how the season has extended. Now they have those, what are 3 or 4 game tournaments you can play early on that only count as one game. Now everybody has a conference tournament, which is an extra 3 or 4 games. Usually a lot of times the NCAA champion is a high 30. I think there's even maybe been one that had 40-0, maybe Kentucky the one year that no, they didn't go undefeated that year. But my point is, if you go back to the mid-'70s, I remember the Indiana Hoosiers, the last undefeated team all the way through the tournament. I think their final record was 32-0. So I think that we've expanded the season. They're playing so many games, and there's so much travel involved anymore. It's all over the country. I think that has a bearing on why we have teams go through slumps, Even the best of Major League Baseball teams over the length of their season, because it's so long and so many games, they have slumps. They'll lose 4 or 5 in a row or something. So I think that's a factor too. But yeah, I hear what you're saying, that it's both, I guess. We have more parity, but again, the cream rises to the top. And I'm just saying the teams that have been the blue bloods that we've talked about. Although there's one we have to mention that hasn't risen much lately, and that's the UK Wildcats.
Well, and that's why I bring up the preseason. They're not doing well, and they're in danger of missing the tournament. But that's why I bring up these rankings. These are the teams they want. If Kentucky does anything, and of course they just had a big win against Alabama the other day, which will help them. They'll find a way to get them in because they want these teams in. You were playing conspiracy theory the other day on our Razor cast with the Big 12, a big East schedule, but I think they're going to find a way, and that's what's going to hurt in the end, especially these big conferences. Kentucky right now sits at 18-9, 7-7 in the SEC, and you got a couple teams like Alabama, which has a big game coming up against Auburn this week. They're at 8-6 and 17-10, or Florida, which has a big game coming up against Tennessee, which could affect the final standings in the SEC. Both of those, they're both sitting at 17-10 and 8-6. Will the people that choose the NCAA find a way to push the Kentucky Wildcats in there, knowing that they're the blue bloods, they're the bigger name that people will want to see in there? And I would think with Florida's reputation, the team that might be on the outs is a team we've talked about yo-yoing, which would be somebody like Alabama or even Missouri, who's had a great year without Michael Porter. Just to pick on the SEC there, that's why I'm bringing up these rankings. I think they're starting to position people both ways. One, to get teams in there that they want to see on national TV, but also you're starting to see them position teams that are out of those mid-majors to say, hey, people, you should be looking at these guys too, like Middle Tennessee State, which finally cracked the top 25, or Houston with that big win over Cincinnati, who finally cracked in after years of being on the, or should say weeks of being on the edges.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting because, in fact, you remember that we had the, I can't even remember what they called it, but 2 weeks ago when they came out with the top 16 seeds. And here's an interesting point, and I think they're trying to show more transparency, trying to show that, yeah, it is objective, But there's a team that's really has thrown a monkey wrench into that, because objectively, 2 weeks ago, they were the 11th ranked team according to the criteria, the quadrants, the wins, and all that. And that's Michigan State, a number 3 seed. Whereas I heard Dickie Vitale last night saying they're a number 1 seed, they should be a number 1 seed. Well, if you use the criteria the NCAA has set forward, they're not. Mm-hmm. And so it's a good point. And will we see a Kentucky thrown in when the metrics are put on it? Maybe they shouldn't have been in, because you and I know that in the end, it's all everything is. It's all about money. And if a UK is part of it, it's going to improve the attendance wherever they're playing. That'll be sold out, and it'll improve the TV ratings one way or another. People who are fans of theirs, their big following, or people who are not fans of theirs that want to see them lose. So it's a good point.
But it's going to be interesting, and that's it, because the other side is you see some storied programs, and you know how I feel about especially preseason rankings. I think they shouldn't even come out to about week 10 when you see the games played this year. You go back, Kentucky, which was number 5. Now they're still hovering there at number 27, even though they're only 500 in their conference, which is down a little bit. We see a lot of teams that are getting no votes at all that were in that top 25. Florida, USC, Miami, Notre Dame, Minnesota, Louisville, Northwestern, Seton Hall. All of these guys, were in the top 25 to start the season. Now they're getting no votes. And that brings me to sort of the next point, which is coming up this week, is all of those teams we just mentioned and more are basically fighting this week for their tournament life. Whereas other teams, when you look at it, they have, they can cruise in. And one of the negatives, you do want to be playing well at the end of the season, but the tournament is how you get your NCAA bid, not the regular season championship. So that begs the question, at this point, should you be fighting, and it's a big pride thing on most campuses, as a coach, should you be fighting to win your regular season conference, or can you sit back and relax? And if you're one of those coaches that has a bit of a lead, should you look at it differently? And I'm talking here more about some of what they call the mid-majors, the lesser majors. You look at teams like Bucknell, which has clinched the Patriot League, Wagner, which has clinched the Northeastern League, and they still have 2 games each to play. Buffalo, which has clinched the MAC East, they've still got 4 games to play. Florida Gulf Coast just has 1 game to play, but they've clinched the Atlantic South. But even Virginia, which is 3 up with 4 to play in the ACC, or Rhode Island, which is 3 up with 4 to play, and they just dropped 1 to the Bonnies. Do you look at this differently? Even Auburn, which is 4 up with 2 to play, does that conference championship matter as much as putting yourself in good position for a tournament run? And again, I look at these mid-major teams again that could very well easily win their conference regular season title, but not get an NCAA bid by the way it's set up, because you got to win your tournament, and their conference may only get 1.
Well, yeah, I think it's important, but I understand your point completely. Again, you want to be playing as well as you can. Do you rest a little bit? Maybe play some players that haven't played, keep your stars, limit their minutes maybe at the risk of losing a game or 2. I think conference championships are important. I think it's the first thing that every team strives for, and I believe I hate to say this way because, nobody's going to agree with this, but it's really almost harder to win a conference than it is a national championship. Now, back up a second. What I'm saying is, because a conference championship is over a 2-month period, playing on the road, different places, playing the same teams twice, a lot of times in the 2 conferences we talk about that do that. And I think, especially in the major conferences, I think it is a goal. Because here's the reality: even if you are the number 1 team ranked in the country and you win your conference, you could lose probably not in round one, but obviously round two a lot of times, and your season's done. But you can still look back and say, hey, it was a successful season if you can say we were ACC champs, we were Big East champs, we were Big Ten champs. So, but again, those mid-majors, that is a dilemma because, again, winning that conference is not going to do anything for them. And it's the only thing it's going to do anything for. And the only thing it does get them, the advantage, is the seeding. But, again, I look at the Horizon Conference, which looks like it's going to end up tied. And that's, they're both, I guess, going to be co-champions. One of them is going to have a 1 seed, 2. I think Northern Kentucky, because they lost to Wright State twice, is going to get the 2. But in reality, they're going to play one more time. Hopefully, I'm sure the Horizon hopes so, in the final game, and that's going to be the one that gets the invite to the NCAA. And again, for a lot of schools, that invite to the NCAA is the crowning jewel. No matter if you finish halfway through your conference, if you still win the NCAA bid for a mid-major conference, that's a successful season. So
and that's what you were talking.
I haven't answered your question.
No, you rarely do, but that's okay. It's a good conversation point. But I agree with you. You can get hot at the right time in March and storm into an NCAA championship. It doesn't happen often, but you have Raleigh Massimino's Villanova team. You have Jim Valbana's North Carolina State team. You have those teams that get hot at the right time, and it is harder because you've only got to win, what is it, 2, 4, 6 games to win an NCAA championship now, is it?
Oh, yeah, 6 games.
Yeah, 6 games in a row. And like you're saying, you can get cold, you can get hot, whereas most of these conference championships, you've got to play 18 games across it. And it is, for most of these mid-majors, it's the crowning point of the year. I just think it's a big dilemma for some of these coaches because they know they're not going to get it unless they win their tournament. And it makes for a tough way to get it. Not everybody's going to be a Duke that's getting hot with their best player on the bench. But the other side of it is, too, a week ago, we might have put Ohio State and Cincinnati in this category as running away with their league, and they got pulled back to the mean with what happened this week, Ohio State losing 2 and Cincinnati losing 2, and suddenly they're in a dogfight just to win their conference with the games they have left. But the other side of that is, coming into this week, we talked last week that we had 8 games with matching top 25 teams, so it was a big team. So you knew, when I come out and say that there were 19 losses, we knew there were going to be 8 because there were teams matched up against each other. That's the nice thing about the schedule. But this coming week and the week after, there aren't nearly as many of those big games, and that I don't think that's, again, going back to anybody saying they want it that way. It's just the way the season has played out, and that gets us into this week, which is going to be a huge week for one of your conferences, Big 12. So let me run through this so people understand it. Kansas has to go to Texas Tech on Saturday. Then they host a dangerous Texas on Monday. They finish at Oklahoma State the following Saturday. Texas Tech, which is now a half game behind after seeming to be in control, they've got an extra game to play. They have to play Oklahoma State at Oklahoma State tomorrow. Again, that hosting Kansas on Saturday. Then they have to go to West Virginia on Monday. They finish with TCU the following Saturday. West Virginia, which is 2.5 back and probably doesn't have a chance to win it, but can certainly play spoiler. They've got Baylor away. They host Iowa State and Texas Tech, and then they finish at Texas. So who do you want to be out of that trident right there when it comes to the Big 12? This is your marching ground.
Who do I want to be?
Yeah.
Kansas. I'm going to say it was said last night. I actually thought it, and then it was said. Bill Self, again, playing for, I believe it's their 14th straight, either co-champions or champions of the Big 12. He's done a phenomenal job. He lost a big man early. They're a little bit thin. but they throttled Oklahoma last night, beat them by over 30, and they're just playing very well. Devontae Graham has finally figured out that Frank Mason's no longer there, and he has to be the leader, and he has to run that team, and he's accepted that challenge. And Kansas, they have I think the better schedule. Even if Texas Tech happens to beat them at Texas Tech in Lubbock, and they already beat them in Lawrence at Fog Island, but they still got to go to West Virginia, and again, that's just a dangerous place to play. I kind of hope Texas Tech pulls off, wins their last 4 and wins just to stop that. But if I was a betting man, I would not bet against the Kansas Jayhawks and Bill Self. Again, it might be his best job ever there because of what he's had to overcome. And, they've lost 3 times, I think, 3 or 4 times in Fog Island this year, which is just unheard of. But if I had to bet money, it was Kansas, and I will repeat that when we made our picks right before the league season started, I did pick West Virginia, and I am going to admit they are not going to win it this year.
Well, you went back to West Virginia after starting off with not knowing. Yeah, I'd agree with you. Kansas, with just 3 games, obviously has the better schedule coming in, and of course, if they can. Of course, they do have the danger of going to Texas Tech. It's kind of a trick question, but actually the team that I would like to be in the Big 12 this week is Texas. They're sitting at 16-11, just 6-8, and when they have to play Kansas State, Oklahoma, go to Kansas State, host Oklahoma State. This is a rough week for Oklahoma State. Then they got to go to Kansas and host West Virginia. If by some chance Shaka Smart can run the table, he's played himself into the NCAA in a year where they've been up and down and not been able to do it, and they get to play, spoiler a little bit, there in the Big 12. Is it going to happen? Probably not, but that would put them at 10-8 in the Big 12 and 20-11 overall. They get to that 20 mark and with some big wins to finish. And right now, I think Texas is one of the most dangerous teams in the Big 12. They may have gotten a little too late of a start, but after, of course, they had a rough spell there where they lost 3 in a row, but they came back and beat Oklahoma. They almost have to win it, and that's part of what I'm talking about, too, with a lot of these teams going into this last couple of weeks. Their tournament run has already started because they know if they can't finish strong, and they're not sure they're going to win their conference tournament, and who can be sure of that, they know they've got to do something to impress the committee now.
Oh, you're exactly right. And here's another interesting, and I'll pull one of your conferences in a little bit, the Pac-12, which I was just reading an article, and the guy said the Pac-12 could have anywhere between 2 and 6 teams, and to your point, depending on how they finish out in the next 2 weeks. But here's another interesting dilemma I think the NCAA is going to have. And there's 2 teams that fit this bill. One we just talked about, Oklahoma, and the other one is Arizona State. Because if you look at the metrics that they have put in, the quadrant system, if you study that and look at it, it's the type of wins you get during the season. Oklahoma has lost 9 of their last 11 games. Not even sure. I think their overall record is like 16-11. They have a losing record now in the Big 12. But over the season, they beat Kansas. They beat Texas Tech. They beat Wichita State. They beat Arkansas. They beat Oregon. They beat USC. By metrics and their system, and in fact, remember, that was the one that was controversial because I think in that first 16 2 weeks ago, they still had them ranked at number 15, even though they had started this downslide. And the other one is Arizona State, who is only about 6th or 7th in the Pac-12. And actually, the writer of that article said, I see 2 teams that already are in the tournament, and that's Arizona, obviously at the top and has some big wins. But the other one was Arizona State because they beat Kansas at Kansas, and they beat Xavier on a neutral floor, and those 2 wins are in Quadrant 1 and give them, all kinds of metrics in that new system. So I think the NCAA is going to have their work cut out for them.
They always do.
and here's the other thing, and I was going to throw out, we talked a little bit, the question is Trey Young, the most valuable player, is he going to get the MVP award? But let's say he does, and we can discuss whether he deserves it or not. Do you keep the MVP of the NCAA out of the NCAA tournament when a lot of people would like to see him in it? And, of course, he's probably gone to the NBA after this year. And, again, I don't know if you want to go in that discussion, but here's a guy that may be the first in the history of the NCAA to lead in scoring and assists, but his team obviously is not doing very well, having lost 9 of the last 11 games. Although at one point they were ranked, second, third? They were like 14-1 or something.
Well, you bring up a couple key points, which deserve a little bit of a counterpoint here. Is Oklahoma, has a great resume throughout the season, but the last 3 weeks, do they deserve it? And the NCAA does. They'll look at those metrics, but they also want to look at who's deserving there at the end. As for the Player of the Year argument, first of all, I don't think that gets announced until after the tournament has started. So you're not going to know. He's obviously one of the front runners, and you have other people, like DeAndre Ayton in Arizona, who's getting hot late and has been in that talking, but the West Coast teams don't get as much press time. I don't think that matters. You would love to see him there, but last year Markelle Fultz was one of the best players in the NCAA, and the year before that Ben Simmons was one of the best players in the NCAA, and they lit it up, but they didn't get the team there. To be honest, that's something I like about Trey Young above the two names that I mentioned, is he does seem to be more team-centered. That's why he stayed in Norman. He's from that area. But I don't think that sort of thing comes into play. As for Arizona State, they do have those metrics where they beat Xavier, which is now up to number 4, and stayed there even after losing to Villanova, in which was a closer game, and we'll talk a lot more about that in our Razorcast. But it all depends. They don't have the marquee games. They're going to finish at Oregon State, at Cal, at Stanford. They're playing the bottom rung of the Pac-12, and that could work for them or against them. If they go 4-0, suddenly they have 23 wins, and they're looking a lot better. They stumble in a couple of those games, like they did against Washington a couple of weeks ago, or Utah, even though they're ahead of them in the rankings now. That could work to keep them out of it. But that's the thing. That's why you play all the games and you play the tournament, and it's fun to speculate ahead. But it's fun to talk about. But when it comes time, we'll have a lot more information in 2 weeks, when they're actually 3 weeks, when they're going to be making these. Go ahead.
I'll make a prediction that the day after Selection Sunday, there's going to be controversy.
Well, that's a real bold prediction.
Thank you.
Yeah, because it's never been controversial before. But I really think that they're going to reward Bobby Hurley and the job he's done at Arizona State, at least put him in there. And again, this week there's not a whole lot of big matchups, so it's teams trying to play the way. And I already mentioned, Alabama is going to go to Auburn, and Florida goes to Tennessee in the SEC, and they might both be playing for their tournament life for the same reason we're talking about Arizona State and Oklahoma paying for those. Of course, Tennessee is about the only team that has a chance to catch Auburn in the SEC, and they're going to need help. So they're definitely going to be rooting for Alabama. And, of course, in the state of Alabama, anything Auburn versus Alabama, you just don't know. So Avery Johnson, who's done a great job there at Alabama, and I named as the team to watch in the SEC, I've been disappointed in their yo-yo style of play, where they'll beat a big team and then lose games they don't. But those are about the only real games going on this week that have sort of high matchups. And even going into last week, there aren't as many as you would expect.
Yeah, and in fact, the Big Ten, you look at the top 3 teams there, none of them really have any challenges, although Michigan State has to go to Wisconsin, who did beat Purdue up there, and Wisconsin seems to be playing a little bit better, and it's a tough place to play. And Ohio State has to go to Indiana. But I think the Big Ten is pretty much settled, even though Michigan State only has a one-game lead. Remember, the Big Ten is ahead of schedule because of their league tournament being a week before the other major conferences. So they only have – this weekend's it for them. So I think that's pretty much said and done. Big East is going to come down between Xavier and Villanova. And if you look at the schedule, Xavier has an easier schedule, but they're actually playing teams that are kind of hot right now in DePaul and Georgetown. So that and then the Providence team that had already beat them. So even though it looks easier on paper, talking about what you talk about, how have teams been playing lately, they're playing some teams that have played very, very well. I think in the Big East, the big game that may decide it is when Villanova goes to Creighton. Can they win at Creighton? Another tough place to play, although they've lost 2 in a row there at home, one to Xavier, and then they just lost to Marquette on Saturday night. So conferences are winding down, and we're gearing up for March Madness.
Yeah, it is. But you're also talking about teams that we know are going to make the dance. It might be a more important game for Creighton, even though Creighton's one of those teams with been talk about yo-yoing. They've been in and out of the top 25, and they're on the periphery. A big win against Nova not only would help your Muskies, but would help their credentials. But a lot of great basketball. I mean, we go through next weekend with most of the conference tournaments, and then conference regular seasons, and then the conference tournaments start right up. So it's going to be March before we know it, and then we're going to be announcing the 68, and we'll go from there, and we'll look forward to talking, being in a better position about knowing these conferences next Tuesday when we have our next Trog cast, and of course you can join us on Thursday for our Razor cast, which is all things Xavier Musketeer basketball. So that leads us to it's always our final segment, which is the trivia and the tidbits.
Oh, man, do I got one for you today.
Oh, you dug deep, huh? Finally went back in the archives and got some dust flowing, huh?
Yeah, although I've written this question down word for word because I know you like hints and clues. So if you listen carefully, and I know you're very knowledgeable in culture, so and a little bit in music, so maybe you should in history. Okay, so
I think you set it up enough there. Why don't you just ask the question?
Okay, here we go. Listen carefully.
I'm listening.
I got to mention that this.
You stumbled right out of the gate. Got what?
Well, as always, this is referring to something that we talked a lot about today, and of course, one of the major topics today was the Big 12. Okay, so just setting it up, that's the topic we're coming from, the Big 12. Okay, you
okay.
With me still? All right,
I'm with you.
The question. Listen carefully, word for word.
Okay.
What famous Texas Tech alum sang about almost heaven when singing a song referring to the name of another Big 12 member?
Well, by the way you have it worded, it's got to be John Denver.
You are absolutely correct. I didn't know he was a Texas Tech alum, but he is.
I didn't either, but, you know.
That's a good question, wasn't it? I left you that at almost heaven, and you had to put, good job, Jeff. You got your thinking cap on today.
Well, I say, the lead in is kind of anticlimactic there, but good. Yeah, John Denver going out. You have music and people. It's always neat to see the celebrities fighting on the sidelines for space to see their teams, and they come out this time of year, and that's great. In my tidbits section, I decided to work.
Jeff, he's not coming out. He's not coming.
Well, John isn't. Just in spirit. Just in spirit.
There you go.
He might be floating over Colorado too, as well as West Virginia.
Well, maybe if the Red Raiders go to West Virginia in that all-important game coming up and they win, they can sing on the floor, "Almost Heaven, West Virginia."
I don't know. Did they ever find his ultralight that he died in? He died in an ultralight crash, I remember. but I think it was out over the ocean. So maybe he just went into hiding. No.
Yeah, I think they did find him, but
no, they didn't.
we digress.
John Dutchendorf Jr. His real name.
There you go.
All right. So I looked at, for my tidbits, working off of everybody, at least I hope you all had yesterday off for President's Day. So I went back to see, a history of the presidents who have competed in interscholastic college athletics. Who's probably the most successful presidents in interscholastic athletics? We got a couple we have to mention, even though they're not interscholastic. One is Abe Lincoln is in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. I didn't know that until I started doing this. He was an amateur wrestler, and he's in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. Can't make this stuff up. I'm not that smart. Don't make fun of the Wrestling Hall of Fame. They'll come and they'll throw you down.
Is it in Iowa?
I don't know where it is. He's just in it for being a great wrestler in his time. Of course, he didn't go to college, and so it can't be interscholastic.
I think you're making that up.
You're going to make fun of everything that I do in these trivia and tidbits like you did last week. You just let me. I don't make fun of your questions. I just try to answer them. Okay? Teddy Roosevelt was an active boxer and rower at Harvard, but he's probably known more for trying to make interscholastic activities safe, especially football. And he's the one that got college presidents together to form an association, which eventually became the NCAA. Herbert Hoover didn't play, but he was the team manager for Stanford football and was the guy who took the tickets at the first big game between Stanford and Cal. And Franklin Roosevelt and George W. Bush were both cheerleaders for Harvard and Yale, respectively. And then we get into more of the athletics themselves here. William Howard Taft was the intramural heavyweight wrestling champion at Yale. This was before they went to interscholastic. He did have some cross college matches, but that was just at Yale.
Is he in the Wrestling Hall of Fame?
I don't think so. We should check that. Probably deserves to be in there. I'm going to leave that for you to look up because you're making fun of it. There's a lot of wrestlers. I hope Darren Shingle doesn't listen to this podcast. You're in trouble.
I'm sure he doesn't.
Yeah. Okay. Woodrow Wilson played a year of college baseball at Davidson before he transferred to Princeton, where he didn't make the team. Dwight Eisenhower played 2 years of football at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point before a leg injury, which happened in a game against Jim Thorpe and the Carlisle Indians, ended his football career. He turned up boxing and gymnastics. He also tried out for the baseball team and said not making the baseball team at West Point was one of the greatest disappointments of my life, maybe my greatest. This is the guy that led people into battle. John F. Kennedy spent 1 year on the Harvard football team, then switched to golf and swimming, played interscholastically. Richard Nixon was on both the football and basketball teams at Whittier College, though he never played a down in football. Ronald Reagan, getting down to some of the best ones, Ronald Reagan lettered 3 times for Eureka College at the football team at the guard position, was also considered the school's top swimmer and was a star on the track team. And probably the 2 most successful presidents in intercollegiate athletics. George Herbert Walker Bush played first base at Yale for 3 years, including being named captain the senior year, and he helped lead the Bulldogs to the first 2 College World Series for those appearances. And probably our most successful president in interscholastic athletics, and it's sad because his reputation is the opposite. That is Gerald Ford. He earned 3 varsity letters in football, playing both ways at Michigan on the line, and helped lead them to back-to-back undefeated seasons and NCAA national titles in 32 and 33. Then after playing in the college all-star football game on January 1st of 1935, he had offers to play in the growing NFL from both the Green Bay Packers and the Detroit Lions, but he chose instead to go to Yale Law School, where he was an assistant coach for the Bulldog football team while he studied there. So lots of connections there. We're glad they went on to hey, it was better than making fun of, the Wrestling Hall of Fame.
Well, and I even had a trivia question in my mind, and you answered it right at the end there. I thought I was going to ask if you knew what position Ford played in football, and
he was a lineman, very small.
He was actually the center on offense.
Mm-hmm. He was the guy. Of course, that we can get into others like Whizzer White who was on the Supreme Court, and he was an All-American at Colorado, and even got some votes for the Heisman in his time. So great traditions of a lot of people that do a lot of things in a lot of different ways. We want to thank you all for listening. We will be back next week with our last February cast for the Trogs. And then, of course, you can join us this Thursday where we'll have lots to say about a big week in Big East football and basketball and what's going on with the Xavier Musketeers. So we will look forward to you listening and looking forward to the end of a fantastic season of NCAA basketball.
March is right around the corner.